welcome everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. We're here to talk about cookbooks. My name is Anna Lavia. I'm the RAS Vice President for the Association of Jewish Libraries. And I will introduce our two guest speakers. So the plan for today is to Tracy Felder and Melanie Myers will talk about their collections, and then we're hoping that a lot of you will share collections either at your library or special things that you have in your own collections. So let me introduce Tracy and Melanie. Tracy Felder began working at the Leo Baeck Institute in 2007, where she's the primary cataloger for special collections and periodicals. Tracy has a degree in German from the University of Oregon and a degree in Library and Information Studies from McGill University. Since 2013, she and archivist Michael Simonson have been running Mahlzeit, Leo Baeck Institute's website about cookbooks and recipes found in the library and archives of the Leo Baeck Institute. And our second speaker, Melanie Myers, is the Director of Collections and Engagement at the American Jewish Historical Society. Prior to joining Ajhs in 2018, she was the Senior Manager for Reference and Outreach at the Center for Jewish History in New York City. She's also been adjunct instructor at the Palmer School of Library Information Science at Long Island University, where she's taught a variety of classes for the Special Collections Rare Book Specialization. She has worked with special collections in a variety of settings, including private, nonprofit, and academic institutions, and has served on outside evaluation teams for other repositories. Melanie lives with her husband and 2 children in Brooklyn. So Tracy, would you like to begin?
Sure.
And if you have questions along the way, please put them in the chat. And after that, we'll open things up to everyone else. So please, Tracy.
Hold on. Okay. So let me first get this. Oops. Sorry. Okay, so you can see the screen, right? The mod
Yes.
side? Mm-hmm. So I put together a cookbook timeline, which with a sort of a brief description of the cookbooks at the Leo Baeck Institute. I'd like to talk about the definition of a Jewish cookbook because Jewish cookbooks usually, Jewish cuisine sometimes isn't, there are a lot of cookbooks that aren't kosher. So Jewish cookbooks usually talk about, like, they either have guidelines for what is kosher or how to cook for Jewish holidays. And it's also important for Women's History Month because they are the largest genre of literature created almost entirely by and for women. And at LBI, we collect cookbooks with German, French, Austrian, Dutch cuisine. We also have non-Jewish cookbooks published by Jewish authors, and cookbooks connected to family collections, and German Jewish cookbooks published outside of Germany, and Jewish cookbooks published recently in Germany. And as a cataloger, I like to talk about the cataloging and access. So I'm sure everyone who catalogs knows that usually use the topical terms cooking, German, or Jewish cooking, Austrian, and there's a genre term cookbooks and community cookbooks. But we also make notes about marginalia, about handwritten recipes in the margins or in the back of the book. And we like to make notes about regional cooking. We also have handwritten cookbooks. and those are sometimes sort of held within collections or cataloged separately. And the archivists will add the term cookbooks, or, you know, and also Jewish cooking, or cooking Austrian, cooking comma Austrian, or cooking similar to what we do. And so, so our collection begins about the 19th century. So we have about maybe like 100 published cookbooks, and the archives has maybe about 100 manuscript cookbooks. I would say that our collection begins about the 19th century. So this is one manuscript cookbook I found. This is actually began being written in 1789. And if you see at the top, it says, like in Judeo-German, Cookbook. And it's written in both Yiddish and German. I think that's very neat. This is another one from the 19th century that is really interesting. It has recipes, but it also has like description of how it is, how you run a household in 19th century Germany. So it describes like taking out the feather beds and how to air them out. And this is one that we've been sort of transcribing together as a group at the Leo Baeck Institute. So it's very interesting. This is there are about two really well-known authors who published in the 19th century, Berta Gombrich and Rebecca Wolfe. And a lot of scholars have written about how they're sort of connected with the German Jews historically becoming middle class, becoming middle class, part of the middle class. And they sort of had, so this is her comprehensive collection of self-tested recipes for the Jewish kitchen, for the preparation of all dishes and baked goods for the everyday and fine kitchen. So she's got like economical recipes, and then she also has fancy recipes, and they're all done within, they're all done to be kosher. So she sort of, it's a way to sort of keep keep the Jewish religion while also maintaining a middle class household. And she had maybe, I think it was 9 editions. This is the 9th edition. And towards when it was published in the 1920s, they started adding, like this medical appendix for like about this appendix says like the hygiene of kosher of Speisegesetze, so like kosher laws, which I think is interesting. It sort of gives a medical approval to what the household was doing. And this is Rebecca Wolfe, who was also very prominent in the 19th century, and she kind of wrote this manual for young brides. And she also includes the Sabbath, the prayer for lighting the candles on the Sabbath. So, and then moving into the 20th century, you start seeing fancier recipes. So this is the widow Marie Cowders, who wrote recipes for Bohemian, Hungarian, English, and French cuisine. And this is another really fancy cookbook, Marie Elsasser, whose cookbook had 3,759 recipes. And this is an example of marginalia we have in our one of our cookbooks. There's an author who writes that that while the men fought a visible enemy, women were fighting the invisible enemy of food rations, or rationed food. So here she has the author had written, or the person who owned this cookbook had written a recipe for Kriegszitronеncreme and Kriegskartoffel pudding. So that's war lemon cream and war potato pudding. Both are from 1916. And I think it's really interesting that making notes about marginalia for recipes from a particular event in history. And also moving into the 20th century, we have these cookbooks from the Frauenbund, which is the women's organization, and they were involved in social work. And this is one from a home for pregnant mothers and small children or people who, like orphans, who they were involved. The women's organization was involved in like training young women up to have professions. And so this is it's called a Feiertagskuchenkalender, like a holiday cooking calendar, which I think they must have done it to raise money for their organization. So it's a neat little pamphlet we have. And here we also have, these are two Jewish authors who wrote cookbooks that weren't Jewish. This is the cookbook from Lena Morgenstern, Lena Morgenstern was known as Soup and Lena, who was, she ran a lot of soup kitchens, and she ran a kindergarten, and she also wrote children's books. And the other side, we have this from Kochen und Würzen, from cooking and like spicing, which is like it's a little pamphlet written by Julie Elias, who was a Jewish journalist and also a cookbook author. And it's to sell like Leah and Perrin's sauce, an English sauce. And this is a very interesting book that when I first had found it in the stacks, I didn't realize it was written by a Jewish author. And it's called So Kocht man in Wien. The author, Alice Urbach, she had, so she wrote the cookbook, her cookbook. It's about Viennese cooking. And then it was around 1938, a lot of Jewish authors, their books were they weren't allowed to publish anymore. So the publishers, to continue publishing books, would just replace their names and sort of plagiarize the book. So when she left Austria, she didn't realize the publisher kept publishing her book and just put someone else's name on it. And when she came back to Vienna after the war, she found the cookbook still in print. And also it still had pictures of her hands in it. And it's a really interesting story. And actually I think there's her granddaughter published a biography about it, and it's coming out pretty soon. And this is an example of something I found related to the Holocaust. It's a newspaper that the only Jewish newspaper allowed to publish during the Holocaust, and it had a little description of how to cook with your ration cards. But I don't really know if this was ever used, but it was sort of interesting to find this in a newspaper. And so now we have these cookbooks published outside of Germany, and this is a very prominent one, Wie kocht man in Eretz Israel, or How to Cook in Palestine. And it taught German Jewish immigrants how to use Palestinian cuisine to cook how to use Palestinian food to cook. And I have an example. It was published in English, German, and Hebrew. And then this is one that is sort of close to my heart, which is it's Recipes Remembered. And it had, sorry, the way the screen, it didn't quite work out to display what I wanted to display, but it's a community cookbook published by Congregation Habonim. And a lot of German Jewish refugees and Holocaust survivors put these recipes together from what they remembered. And it has German recipes, and it also has some very modern recipes, like this low cholesterol cheesecake. And even one of my favorite volunteers actually contributed recipes to this cookbook. And so for more information, you can go to our Mahlzeit blog, which I have the website here. And these are the questions, which I guess we're going to save for after the presentation. So I guess that's all. So I'll stop sharing. Okay.
Oh, thank you, Tracy.
All right, so I guess I'm up next, and then we'll go back to Tracy's slide with the questions, and hopefully other people will then join in. So bear with me for just one moment so that I can find my slides here. Can everybody see it? Can you see? No, hold on.
We see 3 beautifully bound books.
Oh, no, that's just, no, that's just my picture. Hold on, let me,
Oh.
the joys of technology here while we, okay. Now, can you see my blank screen?
All good, yes.
Okay, now we'll pull up the slides. There we go. Minor technical difficulty, but we'll move on. Okay. So cookbooks in the Ajhs collections, probably my single favorite topic to talk about when I talk about the collections at the Ajhs. So Ajhs is for those of you that don't know, the very quick spiel, we are the oldest extant ethnic and cultural library and archive in America. We collect exclusively about the history of the Jewish people in the Americas, which is an extremely broad collecting mandate, which then allows me to collect a very wide variety of materials. We have somewhere in the realm, and I'll confess, I did a quick catalog search today to see how good my numbers were, and I was generally correct. We have somewhere in the realm of 450 to 500 cookbooks, individually cataloged in both the general and rare collections, largely in the general collections. And we also have another 100 or so that are part of the Hadassah archive, which are not individually cataloged. They're actually discoverable through the Hadassah finding aid, organized by region. But we also have another 150 to 200, which are currently in the cataloging queue, because during the pandemic, I gave a lot of talks to women's groups and sisterhood groups and a lot of Hadassah chapters. And I said, send me your cookbooks. And they did. And so that's why we have another 150 to 200 in the cataloging queue. So it's a really nice collection. It's a substantial collection. I'm very proud of it. And it spans about 150 years of American Jewish history. And it runs the gamut. Some are professionally published. A great deal of them were created as community fundraisers, community cookbooks, but they're all in the specific area of American Jewish cookery. And the majority of them in our collection are written by women. Unlike Tracy's amazing collection at LBI, and Tracy, seeing those slides, I just remembered like how some of your cookbooks are so beautiful, especially those handwritten manuscript ones, which is something that we do not have. Because Ajhs, while our collecting mandate is broad, our geography limits us chronologically in that it's only America. So the bulk of our printed books are 1800 and up. So we don't really have a lot of the, actually we don't have any manuscript cookbooks that I know of that I have yet discovered in our collections, but you know, there might be one hiding in there that I'm not aware of. So what is the oldest one that we have? That would be the cookbook of Mrs. Esther Levy, who published her cookbook in Philadelphia in 1871. And, you know, it's modeled on the types of domestic manuals that Tracy was talking about, that Rebecca Wolfe did, but the type of things that was the Mrs. Beaton's book, you know, the serialized cooking and housewifery manuals done in the mid-19th century. So it's not just a cookbook, but it's a how-to for running a household. And again, as Tracy said, clearly aimed at the middle class, you know, because it has things like the principles of economy for Jewish housekeepers, but also, you know, housekeeping, domestic management, assuming, you know, that you have cookbooks and servants, you know, that this upward mobility, you know, that's happening. And this is the first Jewish cookbook that's published in America. And as I said, that's 1871 in Philadelphia. The first Yiddish cookbook wasn't done until the turn of the century, and that was 1901. We do not have a copy, sadly. I wish that we did. But we do not. And so this is held in our rare collection. As you can imagine, it's been used in a great many educational and exhibition uses. It's fully digitized. Although the medicinal recipes, I would say, I always tell people, those are a bit questionable. So I would not recommend utilizing the medicinal recipes from 1871 as I would say our modern knowledge of medicine is far superior. So, but we also have a lot of these community cookbooks, which is a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. And cookbooks as fundraising tools, I feel like are especially significant and have a long history in the American Jewish women's history, but also I would say in American cookbook history in general. And the settlement is by no means the first one. I mean, the first community cookbooks were done in the 19th century, but the settlement is in its own way a community cookbook in that it was a fundraiser for a settlement house. And it obviously went on to, I mean, dozens and dozens of reprintings. One of the most successful and widely read cookbooks of all time. I personally have, I believe, 5 different editions, and I don't mean at Ajhs, I mean in my home. And this is a cookbook that still is, you know, a classic for a lot of people. When I moved into my first apartment, my mother gave me what was then the most updated version of Settlement as a housewarming gift, and I believe that was the edition that was done in the early 90s. And, you know, I use Settlement a lot, especially when I'm talking to student groups, because I found that cookbooks in general are a great tool to talk about historical interpretation and cultural changes, even just looking at the different editions of Settlement and looking at how the subtitle changes and also how the imagery changes, because, you know, women's role in society changes. And somewhere in the 70s, they dropped the original subtitle. It's either the 60s or the 70s, which is The Way to a Man's Heart. And, you know, this is significant because you think about when it's dropped, you know, and I look at all the students and I say, well, what was happening then? And they all look at me like they don't understand. And I say, you know, what those of us that are older would call women's lib was happening then. So you're seeing the marketing people saying, maybe we should drop that part, that maybe that's limiting our audience in a way that we don't want to. I love Settlement. I think it's a fascinating book. But so then the vast majority, I would say, of the cookbooks we have qualify as these community cookbooks, and organizations like Hadassah and many other Jewish women's organizations took that settlement blueprint and just ran with it. And community cookbooks became a staple of fundraising campaigns nationally, regionally, and became an integral part of Jewish women's culture and their community organizations. So from looking at these cookbooks, there's so much more than just the recipes. You know, there's so much more information that we can learn from these cookbooks, like about the organizations themselves, how they're similar or different based on region. I mean, just looking at the different Hadassah cookbooks regionally is an education in and of itself. Who were the individual women involved? And their leadership. You know, a lot of these women's organizations were a real path to leadership and community engagement for many of these women. How these fundraising activities relate to the organization specifically, but also to that much larger landscape of American Jewish history, especially as it applies to women. What are they fundraising for? You know, for Hadassah, it's largely for Israel. It's largely for the the Hadassah Medical Organization and the hospitals and clinics and public health that they were doing in Israel. And one of the things that's a constant in Hadassah cookbooks past a certain point, I want to say probably the 60s, is almost every single one has a particular image in it. And that's of the hospital complex at Mount Scopus, which is this round building that's incredibly distinctive. And all of these cookbooks have either a photo or a drawing of it to remind everybody like what they're fundraising for. But there's also a deeper story too, you know, so, you know, by looking at these things as cultural artifacts, we get great insight into the women and their bonds, you know, as friends, as neighbors, colleagues. I see a lot of these community cookbooks as an outlet. You know, before there were zines, there was community cookbooks, because a lot of these women use them as a creative outlet. They write poems, they do drawings. And these are all expressed in these cookbooks. And again, that path to leadership experience. You know, you see the bonds of their friendship and their sisterhood, you know, what's happening in their communities they talk about their families and their children. They tell stories and, write these wonderful anecdotes. But also just in terms of looking at these items as artifacts, you see the evidence of use. You see the splatters and the notes that people make, the marginalia. And so you can use them as any type of artifact that demonstrates, material culture. My two favorites, though, that I really love to look at are, you really see from year to year, from decade to decade, the changes in what foods people are using in these recipes. The differences in packaging, also how things are being marketed to women, the integration of new types of appliances and preparation methods that start making their way into these community cookbooks. And the one that I feel like we see the most in the American Jewish cookbooks, when you look at them region to region, is adaptation to new communities, to new foodways. As you see Jewish Americans migrating, much farther all over the country, starting in the late 19th century, these cookbooks start to reflect the realities of trying to maintain a kosher kitchen in an environment where the local foodways are not necessarily conducive to that style of cooking, especially when you look at some of the Southern ones are my personal favorites, so you want to adapt and be like your neighbors. But if you're living in Louisiana, a lot of the recipes call for pork, which you're not going to have, and shellfish. So what do? You adapt these recipes, to be respectful of the kosher kitchen. So a few images too. So marginalia, I love marginalia. I love notes in books. This is the oldest of the community cookbooks that's in the Hadassah collection. I do not know if it is the oldest one that was done by Hadassah. I can tell you it is the one that is the oldest in the Hadassah collection, and it was done in Canada, in Toronto, in 1928. And you can see somebody, wrote all sorts of lists and, notes in there. And I also love the forward here. And this is, I put this in to talk about the idea of new appliances and new methods. So we have the old and the new. We have strudel and we have icebox cakes because it's 1928 and people are starting to get, the icebox is becoming, a more and more common thing. But I also love, a lot of these, again, like, just the little notes, I think, here are the homely dishes that could be prepared for the angels, but that you may prepare for modern and critical husbands. And those type of jokes and those types of comments appear throughout the 100 the or so years of community cookbooks. This is great for your picky child, or this is even the most critical of husbands will love this dish. And again, I just it's interesting to see these things that just are constants throughout all of these different decades. And so then we have adaptation. So this is also from a Hadassah cookbook from New England. I believe this one was done in the late 30s. And again, it's very common in regional cookbooks. So this is not the South, though. This is Boston. This is New England. Mock lobster Newburgh. You're not going to make a real lobster. So, what are you going to do? You basically cook the fish in shortening. So you're going to poach it in some shortening. You throw in your lemon juice and then you put it in little bread cups or on rusks. But then you make the cardinal sauce, which is what makes it the Newburgh. It's got that creamy sauce on top. And, we see there's a lot of this in these community cookbooks. Another, let me see if it's on the next one. No, hold on. So one of the other things that you see as well is from decade to decade, you not only see new foods, but you see sort of new types of cuisines that become integrated into, sort of the palate of these various families and communities. A big one is you start to see what I'll call like American Chinese food making its way into these community cookbooks. And when you think about it, it's absolutely a natural fit because a lot of the recipes are naturally kosher. There's very little dairy. So these are recipes that are easily adapted you know, for again, the picky eaters or, you know, whatever in your family. But in the Hadassah cookbooks, especially, you see a lot of that starting in the 70s, I'd say 60s and 70s primarily. And then last, the great Jell-O controversy, which I'm not going to get to in great detail, but this is more back to that idea of, you know, the introduction of different foods into the palate. And I would also say it's corollary, which is how hard it is to sometimes remove these things once they've become, you know, a part of, you know, what families expect and what communities expect on like the potluck table. So the one cookbook where it says jellied vegetable salad, that's 1945. In 1945, Jell-O was still kosher, or was still considered kosher. And it was also aggressively marketed to new immigrants, including Jewish immigrants. Jack Benny, who was Jewish, advertised it on his show. So you're seeing people that are raised in the 40s and the 50s becoming used to Jell-O, becoming used to, you know, this being a recipe that you make, a family favorite for a mom too. I mean, I say as a working mother, you know, Jell-O, how much easier could it be? All you need is boiling water. You have a dessert. Kids like it. It shakes. You know, it probably seems like a lot of fun. But then the other one where we have the apricot mold and the beet and horseradish ring, that is 1983. And by this point, Jell-O, at least Jell-O, the brand Jell-O, was no longer considered kosher. So you would think once it was no longer considered kosher, that you would start seeing it, you know, become less and less in these community cookbooks, and you don't. You see it in these cookbooks really up through the 90s. And yes, by then there's Kojel, which is kosher Jell-O, which obviously you can use, but you can see, and everybody just uses the name Jell-O interchangeably. But I think it's just because, you know, if these are women that are raised in the 40s and the 50s, they're used to these recipes. These are family recipes. These, again, are what you not only serve your families, but you're bringing, you know, to potlucks, and you're putting this out at parties. And so the beet and horseradish ring, which I find, I don't particularly like Jell-O that much, full disclosure, but beet and horseradish and Jell-O, I don't know that I would really want to eat that myself, but I've seen it in repeated cookbooks. So this evidently at some point was, you know, at least, I don't know if it was widely accepted, but certainly appears in multiple cookbooks, let's just say. But I'm going to conclude by saying that what I love about the great Jell-O controversy, and you know, whether it being kosher or not kosher, is it brings back to, I think, my favorite thing about community cookbooks, which I think if you're looking, you know, in terms of looking at some of this culinary history and looking at what people are actually doing, what people are actually eating, these community cookbooks are a great sort of way to take that temperature, far more, I would say, than looking at what cookbooks are selling. Because just because a cookbook is selling doesn't mean that people are necessarily using it all the time, doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, those recipes are becoming part of their usual cuisine. But the community cookbooks, these are recipes that these women put in because it's their favorites, because it is what their family likes, because they have done it a million times. And I think that that is the thing that I love the most about it, because you just see from region to region and decade to decade what these women are doing and what they're feeding their families and how that shifts because of all of these different, you know, larger factors that contribute to how women make these decisions within the domestic economy. So I will finish off. That's me. If you ever need to find me or ask me any questions, that's my email. And ajhs.org is our website. I would also like to point out that on our blog, we have 2 culinary historians that do food-related content for us. So if you're interested in that, they're fantastic. They demo recipes. And one of the historians wrote a great blog post that is specifically about the great Jell-O controversy. And she even makes a Jell-O ring with pictures, if you have any interest. So, and that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And well, oh, Why can I not? How? I'm having trouble stopping the share. Oh, there we go. Okay, beautiful. Now we've read that. So.
Oh, thank you again to both of you. Oh, we have a comment in the chat from Ellen Petler. My mother used to make a gefilte fish, mini fishlets, and beet horseradish jello molds that I never ate. So clearly it was very popular. Yeah, jello is a big feature of community cookbooks. Would anyone like to, does anyone have questions or comments that they would like to ask, or Tybal? Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yes, you are. It's the Yiddish. So on the Lobster Newberg for Melanie, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, I was doing a series of lectures on American Jewish history, and one of them turned out to be about cookbooks with a focus on community cookbooks. And I remember looking at many cookbooks from synagogue affiliates in New York City in the same time period. And it was very interesting which ones had gone to do recipes for actual lobster Newberg, not kosher style. And I thought it was interesting from two perspectives. One is whatever you want to call it, assimilation, but also in terms of Jewish households being able to afford what might be considered more luxury ingredients. I remember one of the cookbooks I did an assessment of just what more expensive ingredients were versus some other communities. And that was very interesting too, looking at American Jewish history, kosher ingredients. And to go back to the settlement one, the early settlement ones also had things on deportment and grooming and acculturation. They were just fascinating. Thank you both for this.
Oh yeah. And also the mock lobster Newberg, I've seen different variations of that in a lot of different recipes. The idea of using a whitefish that basically you make into like a fish ball or a patty or some sort of shape as a substitute for shellfish. I've seen it in a bunch of the Southern ones. Mazel Tov, y'all, has some of those. I love the titles too of some of these cookbooks. They're so much fun. And one that's actually not a fish substitution, but sort of an equally interesting one is we have one called A Russian Jew Cooks in Peru, which is a fascinating cookbook written by a woman whose family emigrated from Russia to South America at some point in the early 20th century. And so she's talking about trying to make traditional Eastern European Jewish food where they don't have all of those ingredients, where it's not the same. And she makes a recipe basically for mock gefilte fish. It's with chicken, which is, Tracy, do you remember when we did the cookbook exhibition a few years back, we put that one in because because we were fascinated by it. All of us were just thinking like, wow, who would have thought? But because the cookbook was done in the 70s and it looks very much like moosewood, that she does all the illustrations herself and they're really cute. And the illustration that accompanies it, it's a hybrid fish basically on chicken feet with a beak. And I should have included a picture. I actually have it hanging in my office. I kept the exhibition plate and put it in my office, but that's another sort of layer, I guess, of that adaptation and substitution. You know, you use what you have at hand, I guess.
Chaim, would you like to ask your question?
So I have at home a few cookbooks, a whole collection, but one of them is a group of cookbooks that are produced by non-Jewish corporate bodies, like the Home Economics Department of the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. Knott's Berry Farm produced a cookbook too. I was wondering if you know anything more, like you have individual authors, Jewish authors, something mostly, or Jewish publishers, but here there's like a different, like a subgenre of who produced these cookbooks for a Jewish audience. That's one question I have. I have a second question. Also, I have also at home, so you mentioned there was like the idea of like the Chinese cookbook or kosher Chinese. There's also like an author, I forgot her name, I think Ruth Grossman, maybe. There's a 4-volume set, like kosher Cajun, kosher Southern, kosher Chinese, and kosher French. I think that was the 4. And then
Yeah,
something
we
about
have
mash.
we have 3 of the 4. There's one that we're missing. We have the French, we have the Chinese, and we have one other, but we don't have all 4.
And there's also enjoying to Nash, I think was the other one, number 5. But the idea of going beyond Chinese by going to other ethnic community, other ethnic type foods. And I growing up in LA, well, it wasn't that common, but now LA has a whole bunch of like ethnic kosher, so to speak. It's a whole field by itself. And I was wondering, when did it happen at the same time roughly as the kosher Chinese, or around Bernstein's when it came out? Bernstein's on Essex Street was, I think, the first kosher Chinese restaurant. I think that's around the same time.
That I am not sure about. I'm not sure when that restaurant was found. Like I said, I know that when, like the ones we have in our collection, and again, I work extensively with our collection, but there's tons of stuff that I've just never seen. So we see it start appearing really in like the 60s, I would say, which I feel like is when the American love affair with American style Chinese food started much earlier. I mean, Le Choy was started in like I think like the 20s. And so then you start seeing it, being integrated more just as a kind of cuisine that people like. I mean, this is, I feel like there's all these things that have become part of like American cuisine, but are really from all of these other ethnic groups that then, just these people's palates expand and you just become more accepting of all of these other food types that you don't just want to eat like the same thing all the time. And I think it's just part of a much larger like cultural phenomenon, I guess. And somebody asked if we are looking for more community cookbooks. Yes, always. Email me. Absolutely. My catalog is going to hate me, but yes. Yes.
I was going to ask my colleague at Stanford, Ajhs, to also field that question because he's collected a great deal. Yeah, they're very big now at academic libraries. Hi, Ajhs. Do you want to, Ajhs, would you like to talk about Stanford's collections a little bit?
Sure. We've been collecting a lot of Jewish community cookbooks, especially for the last few years since I arrived. It started actually, I would say, when Anna used to help us with the Judaica collecting, and she brought a few Jewish community cookbooks in. And then our American history curator brought an extremely large collection of regional and ethnic cooking across the board, which includes a lot of Jewish community cookbooks. So when I came here, we had around 40 Jewish community cookbooks, and that's kind of an in-between number from collection development purposes. As far as I see, either you need to have only a couple because then you can kind of use them in teaching and show off, or you really need to have several hundred or more. I mean, ideally, so that you can really use it as a resource and you can attract scholars to come and work with them. So we have around 250 Jewish community cookbooks now, from trying to mostly purchased, although also some gifts. We got a nice size gift collection about 2 years ago. And we also try to collect food ephemera as well. So menus, some buttons, any kind of designs, but things that would help tell the story of Jewish food. We, by virtue of where we are, we're getting mostly North America, but also trying to find kind of going even more local and finding, well, what were Jewish restaurants in San Francisco at different times, which is often really only accessible by looking for things like historical menus. They haven't left a lot of other traces. So it's been a great project, and it kind of dovetails also with increased faculty interest in food studies in general. And I'll say the one thing that Melanie said that I completely agree with is the titles are incredible. They're usually loaded with puns. They're loaded with humor, sometimes in multiple languages. But the other thing is that the artwork is fantastic. That when you buy Jewish community cookbooks, often you're getting like this wonderful folkloric exploration of different communities and you have local illustrations, and you can always tell when they're kind of working with off-the-shelf designs or when someone in the community has put this together with love and care.
Oh, thanks, Eitan. Linda, would you like to ask your question?
Yep. Yes. Thank you. I'm Linda Roth. I'm at the Myers Library at Knesset Israel in Elkins Park, PA. And first, I'm doing this at home, and I happen to have, per what you were talking about, I have the Kosher Jewish book trilogy by Ruth and Bob Grossman that had Chinese kosher cookbook, Italian kosher cookbook, and French kosher cookbook in one volume. So I thought that was interesting. One thing, the cookbook collection at the Myers Library seems to be sort of bifurcated. There's a number of community cookbooks, but also the celebrity chefs now, the Israeli celebrity chefs, and the coffee table beautiful picture book cookbooks. So there's a sort of bifurcation of the collection that way. But as far as being a lending library, I'm finding that I wanted to have a cookbook event, and a lot of the people were saying, why cookbooks? We can just go to the internet now. We pull recipes off the internet now. And I just thought I'd bring that up as a comment, as a generational culture change. If anybody else had anything to comment about that.
We have found that anytime we do an event about cookbooks, when I said, years ago, Tracy and I, because Ajhs and LBI are in the same building, we did a cookbook exhibit that featured from all the 5 libraries. And I was shocked at how many, it was the first exhibition I worked on. I was shocked at how many people came, how well attended the events were. I think people love to hear about food. People love to hear about cookbooks, even if you might not buy a cookbook yourself, even if you might just look it up on the internet. I have 70 cookbooks in my apartment. I still look up recipes on the internet. But I think there's something that's, that's also just nice about a cookbook, something tactile about holding it. And again, I like to also talk about them as just even as objects, even if you're not interested in doing the recipes. And some of them I think I definitely don't want to do. But there's still like a lot of fun to be had and a lot of interesting information to be gleaned. And I love your comment about the celebrity cookbooks. One of my favorite ones is the Celebrity Kosher Cookbook, which is absolutely hilarious because it's all of these, and they all tell stories about how this recipe came about, and they are absolutely hysterical. And there's one recipe from it that always sticks in my mind, which is Joan Rivers, because it is exactly what you'd expect from Joan Rivers. It's a salad that is, you cut a pear in half and you hollow out the seeds and you put caviar in the hole. That's it. And that is exactly what you would expect that Joan Rivers would do. And that one always sticks in my mind. So yeah, I love those. Those I think are wonderful. And you don't see those anymore, really. That like, now you have celebrity chefs, but you don't really see somebody saying, I'm going to write to like every Jewish person I can think of in Hollywood and ask them to send in their favorite recipe. Like you don't see that anymore. So.
Chaim?
So I have two new questions. One is, so you have cookbook, but then you also have sometimes like food products come out with recipes, or sometimes like a mini brochure type recipe. I know like Philadelphia cream cheese sometimes will have inside a container a recipe, or cake mixes will have another additional recipes. Has there ever been like a collection of that put together? I know that's probably even harder to do than cookbooks. Cookbooks is much more, it's published and accessible.
One thing, Mishevitz, Amanda Shevitz around Passover time often comes out with a Passover recipe with their products.
Yeah, we have a few of those throughout the years.
Ephemeral.
Yeah, I would love to collect more food ephemera. I would love to, we do have some of those recipes that are cut out, but largely they came in the cookbooks that were donated. So they're, things that, a woman, clipped out of the newspaper you know, again, clipped off the box and put in there.
Right.
That's something I would actually really like to explore more. And I would love to get more food ephemera. We do have some of those manufacturers' cookbooks. As I said, we have a bunch of the Manischewitz ones. And my personal favorite is the Crisco one that was done in the 30s by Procter and Gamble. Well, yeah, it is a masterpiece of direct marketing. That's what it is. It's done in English and in Yiddish. And so this is the 30s, and you can tell what happened is somebody at Procter and Gamble, because that's who makes Crisco, said, listen, there's this huge wave of Jewish immigrants that just came in. They're kosher. Crisco is kosher and it's shelf stable. We're not marketing aggressively enough to this whole consumer group. And so they made this cookbook, and I used it a million times for exhibitions, for talks. And then after probably the 20th time I read it, I noticed the little note that's on the inside cover that says that it was specifically done in English and in Yiddish so that a Yiddish speaking mother and an English speaking daughter could use it together. So they're thinking so, like, again, it's a masterpiece of direct marketing. They were seriously thinking demographically about who their target audience was and aggressively marketing to them. I've never made any of the recipes. I don't know if they're any good. I don't use a lot of Crisco, I'll be honest. So.
That's cool. The second question I had was regarding communities that have cookbooks. What are like the pop? So when I lived in LA, the number one cookbook, or not the number one, most popular cookbook was the Moosewood cookbook. Not kosher, but it was vegan enough that you can adapt it. And I was wondering,
yeah, Jewish author.
If you're exactly right. That's true. Yeah. Because then, if you're familiar with, like, in terms of popularity of cookbooks in certain areas, like, you know, there were, well, I can't think of it, but, you know, sometimes it's like, you know, well, this community likes this cookbook more or over this person, just because. And then same thing here, or accessibility to cookbooks. Are you familiar with anything that kind of study, I guess, that has been done?
No, but I'm sure it very well may be out there. Like I said, I'm super familiar with like what's in our collection because I spend so much time with it. But you know, it is. I'm sure that people have written articles. There's so much more work being done on cookbooks as a genre,
Right.
as you know, culinary history. I mean, I've seen some great work done by people in academic libraries using cookbooks as instructional tools. Like it's yeah.
That's true.
Right. So.
Thank you.
All right. Well, Tybal, do you have a question?
If no one else does, if I may do a little personal one for Melanie. My mother was an inventive cook and baker who made up recipes, and she was also a regional Hadassah person who went to national things. And she used to look at Hadassah cookbooks, and she bought in bulk and gave to people for decades something called the Rochester Hadassah Cookbook from Rochester, New York. And I'm just curious if you have any sense of which Hadassah cookbooks were really the star standout, and if Rochester was up there.
I'm from Rochester. My mother and some of my mother's recipes are in the Rochester Hadassah cookbook. Yeah.
Oh,
So
all
now
right.
I have to ask what your mother's name was so I can go look at my copy and look for her recipes.
Ruth Confeld, Confeld.
I'm going to look myself now. I always love it when I find out, you know, people who personally contributed. The one that I know of that was very popular was done by the Beverly Hills Hadassah, from noodles to strudels. And that one was very popular. They had a very high production value, and even being sort of in its own self-published way, went into 2 printings. So, and a sequel. So.
Eitan, do you have a question, comment?
Just saying the Rochester one was very popular. It went into a lot of different editions, and you can find them kind of actively for sale because they've been with people for a long time. And yeah, that's the book. I see Linda showing it off. It's a great one, and there are multiple editions of it.
Naomi?
I'm wondering if you collect any event cookbooks. I have a number of cookbooks where that were given out at weddings for couples. The guests who were invited to the wedding were asked to participate and send in their favorite recipe with a message to the bride and the groom, and then they give you the cookbook. I'm not sure if some of them I've gotten at showers or at weddings. Melanie, are you collecting those at all?
I would gladly collect those. Absolutely.
Melanie,
What a great idea. I can't believe people don't do that more.
You guys.
That's a fantastic thing. Yes, I would gladly take it. Naomi, you know where to find me, so you can just.
I know, but you know what? I'll ask my sister because she did it for her son's wedding. I'll ask for a copy for you, Melanie. Okay.
Thank you.
Tracy, do you have a comment?
Oh no, I just was going to say, Melanie, I cataloged a wedding cookbook for you for.
You did. All right,
Yeah,
I got to look at it. I haven't seen it. I
Actually,
haven't.
It was a wedding I went to, and they gave out cookbooks, and I gave it to you guys.
All right, I'm gonna have to look that one up. Thank you, Tracy.
I can send you a link to that for it.
Yes, send me a link to the catalog. Yes, thank you.
Do you still have a comment, Naomi, or is your hand just up? Oh, okay. Tybal, do you have a?
If there's time, I was going to say one more thing. Something someone said just reminded me of something else I looked at when I was putting together that talk, which is serving size. Because, for example, there was a particular cookbook when the HIV crisis was at its worst, I think out of San Francisco, where the serving size were all one versus larger. I mean, that was another way to assess, looking at American Jewish history, what the norm for serving size is for recipes.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you.
Oh, well, we're almost at time. Does anyone have a final question or comment? Okay, well, I want to thank Melanie and Tracy and all our wonderful participants very much. This is, cookbooks are awesome. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting us.
And thanks to Chaim for hosting also, and Malia.
Thank you.
Oh, bye you. Yeah.
I'm going to stop recording.
It's our Zoom bomber.
Thanks, Anna, very